During the golden age of Hollywood, every studio was notable for a particular genre of film that they were exceptionally good at, with MGM being the undisputed king of the musical, as I went into further detail on in another video, which you can find a link in the description to. But all good things must come to an end, as they say, and as 20th Century Fox started hitting it big with their many epic musicals, most of which were adaptations of famous Broadway shows, as well as Warner Brothers having hit starring Doris Day, it was clear by the mid-50s that MGM was being dethroned. But that didn't stop them from continuing to put out new musicals, which culminated in the film that marked the unofficial end of MGM's reign as the king of the Hollywood musical. And today, I'd like to go over this particular movie and specifically why it marked the start of MGM's downfall. And for what it's worth, there will be spoilers for this movie ahead. So in case you'd like to see it first and draw your own conclusions from it, you might just want to be on the lookout. You have been warned. Okay, so the movie in question here would be 1955's Hit the Deck, based off the 1927 stage musical of the same name, which in turn was based off a 1922 play, Shore Leave. This movie shares only a few songs and the general theme of US sailors being on shore leave with its inspirations, having a completely different plot than either stage show or their earlier movie adaptations. And to better understand why this movie marked the downfall of MGM, a plot summary would be a good place to start. So Hit the Deck centers around three sailor friends in the US Navy, Clark, Smith, and Ferrari, who all get shore leave in San Francisco at the same time. So Smith goes home to visit his father, who's a very respected naval officer, and his sister Susan, who he finds out has been dating actor and notorious rake Wendell Craig, and that she has a private audition with him. So in order to save his sister from his advances, Smith, Clark, and Ferrari end up crashing the audition and getting into a fight, causing the three to have to go on the run when Craig calls the naval police on them. And as they try to stay one step ahead of the shore patrol, Clark must make up with his own fiancée, who's angry about him keeping her waiting so long to get married. Ferrari ends up falling in love with Susan while also trying to get his widowed mother back together with her own beau, who's off put by her having an adult son, and Smith has to try and keep his sister's name out of the scandal they caused, while also falling in love with and pursuing performer Carol Pace. And that's before Smith's father becomes directly involved and tries to figure out what exactly happened in Craig's apartment and how to deal with the ensuing fallout.
You understand it now?
Oh, sure.
Then explain it to me.
Confused? Don't worry, you weren't the only one. This movie has more plot threads running through it than a sewing machine, and it becomes very hard to keep track of everything without getting lost. And now you're probably wondering why anybody would write such a complex plot for what should be a simple musical. And the answer to that is a surprisingly easy one. With Hollywood's vastly changing landscape in the mid-1950s, and not to mention increasing competition from other studios, MGM's chief strategy was to pack as many stars as they had into a single film, hoping that star power alone would be enough to sell them. And while that had actually worked before in some of their previous musicals, the difference was that the stars in question were usually only brought in for specialty numbers and had no bearing on the plot, with only a couple of them having a role of any significance. But because Hit the Deck was a more traditional musical, any and all stars recruited for it had to be characters incorporated into the plot, and the results were the overstuffed, disjointed romp that I just described. And what only made things worse was that in addition to established stars Jane Powell, Debbie Reynolds, Russ Tamblyn, Walter Pidgeon, Ann Miller, and Gene Raymond, the movie also brought in Tony Martin and Vic Damone, who were very popular singers in their day but not really established actors, in the hopes of both that their presence would boost sales for the film as well as establish them as musical stars, though they didn't exactly prove to be Sinatra or Crosby on screen, and needless to say, never really made it big in the movies. And then there was Kay Armen, who was a very famous singer in the 50s that the producer was determined to introduce to audiences with a splash, hence why the subplot involving Ferrari's mother was included in order to give her a substantial role. But similar to Martin and Damone, the audience didn't take to her, and she stuck mostly to singing afterwards. So the point is, not only did they cram a bunch of famous stars into the film in hopes of selling tickets, but they also squashed in even more people, hoping that it would give them their big breaks too. And once again, the results were a plot that could only be described as an overstuffed mess. There's about a dozen plot lines going on at the same time, and it's almost impossible to keep track of all of them. And what only makes things worse is that about half the musical numbers don't even have any bearing on the plot either. And this is especially egregious because musicals from back in the day, and especially MGM musicals, were always known for being very simple and easy to follow in nature, as I further explained in another video, which you can also find a link in the description too. So the fact that the movie has so much going on and keeps throwing so many characters at the audience all at once, to the point that some of them, most notably Debbie Reynolds' character, barely have any impact on the plot at all and is more just there, was a clear indicator that MGM was going downhill. Because as a consequence of this bizarre structure, there's nothing all that remarkable about the film with only two exceptions. The first being, somewhat ironically, the famous Funhouse dance sequence with Debbie Reynolds and Russ Tamblyn, as well as Hallelujah, the final number in the film, which has gone on to be one of the most beloved and well-regarded musical sequences in the golden age of Hollywood. Though to be completely fair, Ann Miller also gets a couple of relatively impressive numbers of her own too, so it's not like the movie doesn't have anything to offer, it's just all in the music and not with the story. And as a result of prioritizing star power over a good plot, audiences weren't too invested in the final product. It did do decent money for its time, but not enough to impress MGM, so they ended up terminating the contracts of most of their stars, with only Debbie Reynolds and Russ Tamblyn still being under contract for them by the time the 60s rolled around, and MGM would mostly abandon musicals in favor of material that was more popular with audiences, to limited success. And it was around the same time that MGM acquired a huge debt that it would ultimately never be able to pay off, resulting in them merging with United Artists before both would eventually be sold off and their backlog being bought by Warner Brothers, who still owns it to this day. Though funnily enough, Hit the Deck not only marked the beginning of the end for MGM, but was in many ways a last hurrah for what the studio had been, as it contains a few sequences in isolation that are very well regarded, as I noted before. And these days it's often looked on by movie experts, which I like to note I am not, with a definite finality to it, since it has the last gasps of MGM greatness and the final performances by many of their most well-regarded stars, while also containing many of the elements that would go on to kill the studio in the following decades, because Hit the Deck was ultimately anchored down by the executives' bad decisions, and it would be far from the last movie to suffer for it. Though MGM would go on to make a few more acclaimed musicals afterwards, but on the whole, films like Hit the Deck made it clear to audiences that their days as the king of the musical had passed, since they were putting star power and profits ahead of what everybody loved about their classic musicals in the first place. So while it wasn't the movie that killed the musical or the studio by a long shot, Hit the Deck most definitely marked the end of an era for MGM, and they would never reach the heights of that golden age again. Alright, I think that ends this little history lesson. So now why don't you tell me? Do you think that Hit the Deck is the perfect representation of MGM's decline in the mid-1950s with how they overstuffed the narrative full of stars in a desperate bid to attract audiences? Or do you believe that it wasn't nearly as bad as I'm making it out to be? Or had you never even heard of it before you clicked on this video? Whatever the case, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. Because as always, you don't have to agree with any of the more opinion-based parts of this video if you don't want to. You can feel about this or any other topic we discuss here however you'd like, and if you think I had it all wrong, that is totally fine. And thank you all for watching. It is all really appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.